It is 5:47 in the morning on March 3rd, 2023. In the artisanal mining zone outside Kolwezi, in the Lualaba province of the Democratic Republic of Congo, a 12-year-old boy named Dorson has already been underground for 2 hours. He is not wearing boots. He is not wearing a helmet. He is carrying a hand-carved wooden tool and a grain sack, and he is digging in a shaft so narrow that a grown man cannot fit inside it. That is why they send children. The shaft goes 11 meters down, and there's no ventilation. There's no support structure. There's no rescue plan if it collapses. When Dorson fills his sack with enough ore, he will drag it back up to the surface and hand it to a man who will weigh it, pay him the equivalent of $1, and send him back down. That ore is cobalt. And before the end of this year, a refined version of what Dorson just dug out of the ground will be sitting inside a lithium-ion battery, inside a smartphone, an electric vehicle, or a laptop computer, sold somewhere in Europe, North America, or East Asia for between $480,000. The Democratic Republic of Congo holds an estimated 70% of the world's known cobalt reserves. Every major technology company on Earth depends on it. Apple, Samsung, Tesla, Microsoft, Sony. The global cobalt supply chain passes through this country, through these mines. If through these children and the people who profit most from it have constructed a legal and logistical architecture so sophisticated that by the time that cobalt reaches a finished product, it is almost impossible to trace it back to the shaft where Dorson was digging at 5 in the morning. There are approximately 40,000 children working in artisanal cobalt mines in the DRC right now, not 40 years ago, right now, today. So how did the most valuable mineral on Earth become the most exploited? And why, after decades of exposure, is nothing changing? My name is James Carter, and this is the African Radar, where we follow the supply chains that powerful corporations need you to forget exist. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly why your phone battery is inseparable from one of the worst ongoing human rights crises of the 21st century, and why the companies that profit from it are betting that you never make that connection. Now let me take you back to where this started. The Democratic Republic of Congo has been one of the wealthiest countries in the world in terms of raw natural resources for over 150 years. It has also been, for almost exactly that same period, one of the most systematically looted nations in human history. The first theft was rubber. In the 1880s, King Leopold II of Belgium claimed personal ownership over the entire Congo Basin, an area roughly the size of Western Europe, and turned it into a private extraction operation. Workers who failed to meet rubber quotas had their hands cut off. Entire villages were massacred. Scholars estimate that between 10 and 15 million Congolese died under Leopold's regime between 1885 and 1908. When international pressure finally forced Belgium to take formal colonial control from Leopold, yet the extraction continued, only the paperwork changed. Then came copper, then came diamonds, then came coltan, the ore used in capacitors and mobile phones, which fueled a proxy war in eastern Congo in the late 1990s and early 2000s that killed an estimated 5 million people and is still, in degraded form, ongoing today. And now cobalt. The man most responsible for constructing the modern cobalt extraction system was not a mining executive. He was a Belgian colonial administrator named Jules Cousin, who in 1906 helped establish the Union Minière du Haut-Katanga, a mining company that would control Congolese copper and cobalt extraction for the next 60 years, with profits flowing to Brussels, while Congolese workers were paid in scrip redeemable only at company stores. When Congo formally gained independence in 1960, Union Minière did not disappear. It was eventually nationalized, then collapsed. It then reconstituted under different corporate identities. Its assets passed through a series of mergers and acquisitions until they emerged in the early 2000s as Glencore, today the single largest cobalt producer in the world, headquartered in Switzerland. The colonial infrastructure became the corporate infrastructure. The extraction never stopped. Only the flag above the office changed. By 2010, the global shift toward electric vehicles and portable electronics had turned cobalt from a moderately valuable industrial metal into something closer to oil. Demand projections were staggering. The International Energy Agency estimated in 2021 that cobalt demand could increase by as much as 21 times current levels by 2040 if the world hit its electric vehicle adoption targets. Every major car manufacturer, Volkswagen, General Motors, BMW, and Toyota, was entering long-term supply agreements. Every major technology company was scrambling for reserves, and 70% of those reserves were in one country, a country with no functioning central government in its eastern provinces, a country where artisanal miners, called creuseurs in French, had been digging cobalt by hand for decades, because industrial mines cannot always access the narrow, shallow deposits that run through the hillsides around Kolwezi, Kipushi, and Fungurume. In a country where the legal framework for regulating artisanal mining existed on paper and essentially nowhere else, the global technology industry saw this situation and made a calculation. It is important to say exactly what that calculation was, because the companies involved have spent enormous amounts of money making sure you never hear it stated plainly. The calculation was this: artisanal cobalt is cheaper than industrially mined cobalt, and it does not require the capital investment of mechanized extraction. It does not require full compliance with international labor standards. It arrives at the trading post already dug, already sorted, already worth money, because the people who dug it, including children, absorbed the cost of digging it with their bodies for $1 a day, with no legal protection and no recourse. A 2016 report by Amnesty International titled "This is What We Die For" documented the complete supply chain from artisanal mines in Katanga province through local trading houses, through Congolese export companies, through international mineral traders, all the way to battery manufacturers supplying Apple, Samsung, Sony, and Microsoft. The report found that none of these companies could confirm that their cobalt supply chains were free of child labor. Some could not even name the companies from which they purchased their cobalt. Apple's response when contacted by Amnesty was that it was committed to responsible sourcing. Samsung said it was investigating. Sony said it would endeavor to ensure. Microsoft said it was deeply concerned. Not one of them stopped buying. The woman who led that Amnesty investigation was a researcher named Audrey Gauguin, then director of global issues at Amnesty International. And in a 2016 interview, she said, "The glamour and the luxury of the latest smartphone comes at an unacceptable human cost, which is being borne by some of the world's most marginalized people." She was right, and she was ignored, because by 2016, the electric vehicle revolution was no longer a future possibility. It was a present reality. Tesla had delivered its first mass-market Model 3. China had announced that by 2025 it required 20% of all new vehicle sales to be electric. Yet the European Union was moving toward banning combustion engines by 2035. The demand for cobalt was not going to slow down. It was about to accelerate beyond anything the industry had previously imagined. And the DRC's artisanal mining sector was not going to be cleaned up. It was going to be scaled up. A 2019 investigation by the Washington Post documented children as young as 6 working in mines near Cobalt. It documented tunnels collapsing and burying miners alive, yet with no official death count because artisanal mine deaths are not systematically recorded. It documented miners developing a lung condition called cobalt lung, a form of hard metal pneumoconiosis that causes progressive, irreversible respiratory failure because they work without masks in dust clouds of toxic ore. One miner interviewed for that investigation, a man named Evariste, who had been mining cobalt for 9 years, said he did not know what cobalt was used for. Yet he had never seen a smartphone. He had never seen an electric car. He said, "All I know is that when I bring this ore to the trader, I get enough to eat for one more day." The total value of cobalt exported from the DRC in 2022 was approximately $5 billion US. The DRC's per capita income in 2022 was approximately $580 per year. That gap between the total value of the resource extracted and the income of the people living above it is not an accident. It is the architecture. It is the system working exactly as it was designed to work. Then came July 2021. Felix Tshisekedi, who had become president of the DRC in 2019, announced a major review of all mining contracts signed during the presidency of his predecessor, Joseph Kabila. Tshisekedi's government claimed that dozens of contracts had been signed on terms that were grossly disadvantageous to the Congolese state, terms that in some cases gave foreign corporations effective tax holidays for decades and royalty rates so low they constituted a structural gift. The world media covered this primarily as a political story, as a power struggle between Tshisekedi and the Kabila political machine. The business press covered it as a risk factor for mining investors. Will the DRC become unstable? Will contracts be renegotiated? Will Glencore's position be threatened? Almost no major outlet asked the more obvious question. As if the contracts were as bad as Tshisekedi claimed, and early evidence strongly suggested they were, then who had written them? And who had benefited from writing them that way? The answer to that question runs through a network of offshore holding companies. A Congolese businessman named Dan Gertler, a personal friendship with President Kabila, and a sanctioned deal structure that the U.S. Treasury Department described in 2017 as a pattern of corruption that cost the DRC at least $1.4 billion in mining revenues between 2010 and 2012 alone. Dan Gertler is an Israeli diamond and mining billionaire who built his initial access to the DRC by selling weapons to Laurent Désiré Kabila during the late 1990s war. That access gave him preferential rights to Congolese mining assets. Those assets were then sold or transferred to international mining corporations, including Glencore, through deal structures where the DRC State Mining Company received a fraction of the market value of the assets involved. The U.S. Treasury sanctioned Gertler in 2017 under the Global Magnitsky Act, describing him as having used his close friendship with DRC's president to act as a middleman for mining asset deals, enriching himself and his associates at the expense of the Congolese people. Glencore paid him hundreds of millions of dollars in royalties even after the sanctions. They did this through a mechanism that legal experts described as a sanctions workaround, continuing to pay royalties in euros rather than dollars, which technically avoided triggering U.S. financial system restrictions. The payments continued until Glencore reached a settlement with Gertler in 2022 and agreeing to pay him an additional $150 million in exchange for ending all royalty obligations. Glencore also, in that same period, pleaded guilty to bribery charges in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Brazil, paying over $1 billion in fines for corrupt payments to government officials in multiple African countries, including the DRC. But here's what nobody talks about. The problem is not Dan Gertler. The problem is not even Glencore. Removing one corrupt middleman and fining one mining corporation does not address the structural reason why the DRC's cobalt wealth continues to flow outward rather than staying inside the country where it was found. The structural reason is that the global technology and automotive industries, the companies that make the products you and I buy every day, have actively resisted every serious attempt to create mandatory, legally enforceable supply chain transparency. In 2010, yet the United States passed Section 1502 of the Dodd-Frank Act, which required companies listed on U.S. stock exchanges to disclose whether their products contained minerals sourced from conflict zones in the DRC. It was a limited measure. It covered only tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold, not cobalt, and the Trump administration suspended its enforcement in 2017. But even that limited measure produced intense industry lobbying against implementation. A study published in the American Economic Review in 2017 found that the regulation had actually reduced income for some eastern DRC miners by disrupting trade, a finding the industry cited constantly while barely mentioning the context that eastern DRC mining was also financing militias that had killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. In 2021, yes, the European Union moved toward a battery regulation that would require companies selling batteries in European markets to conduct and disclose due diligence on cobalt supply chains, including artisanal mining. The regulation was adopted in 2023. It requires cobalt traceability by 2025. Apple, Tesla, and Samsung have all made public commitments to responsible cobalt sourcing. Apple launched a responsible sourcing program. Tesla signed an agreement with Glencore to source cobalt from Glencore's industrial operations rather than from artisanal supply chains. These are real steps. They are also incomplete ones, because artisanal mining does not disappear when large corporations announce they will no longer purchase from it. The artisanal ore goes to Chinese trading companies, which now handle an estimated 60% of all cobalt purchasing in the DRC. And China is under no equivalent regulatory pressure from Brussels or Washington. The ore moves from cruciers to local traders to Chinese aggregators to refineries in China, which process approximately 80% of the world's cobalt, and then to battery manufacturers across Asia and Eastern Europe who supply the global market. Your phone company says it has a clean supply chain. Yet your phone company buys batteries from manufacturers who buy refined cobalt from refineries, who buy raw cobalt from traders, who buy from anyone. The chain has been deliberately engineered to be untraceable. Right now, in the mines outside Cobalt, the situation on the ground has changed and has not changed. The DRC's new mining code, passed in 2018, increased royalty rates on cobalt from 2% to 10%, a significant improvement that has increased government revenue. But President Tshisekedi's administration has made genuine efforts to formalize artisanal mining through a program called Zones d'Exploitation Artisanale, or ZEAs, designated areas where artisanal miners can operate legally and where state-affiliated cooperatives are supposed to provide equipment, training, and fairer pricing. The implementation has been uneven. Many ZEAs exist on paper. Yet the cooperatives are in some cases controlled by politically connected individuals who take a large cut of the ore value before it reaches the miner. And outside the ZEAs, unregulated artisanal mining continues at scale. In a 2022 report by the Business and Human Rights Resource Center found that child labor in cobalt mining had declined modestly between 2015 and 2022 from approximately 40,000 children to approximately 30,000, but attributed much of that decline to reduced cobalt prices during the 2019 market downturn rather than structural change. When cobalt prices rose again in 2021 and 2022, child labor numbers rose with them. In the mining community of Kipushi, about 30 kilometers from the Zambian border, a Congolese human rights organization called ACIDH, Action contre l'impunité pour les droits humains, has been documenting mine deaths and injuries since 2004. Their researchers have recorded hundreds of tunnel collapses, chemical exposures, and deaths that never appear in any official record because the DRC has no systematic artisanal mine safety reporting system. ACIDH's director, Emmanuel Umpula, he told The Guardian in 2021, "We are not against mining. Mining is the economy here. We are against a system that says some people's children are worth less than others." Some people see reason for cautious hope. The EU battery regulation is real. Chinese corporations, under growing domestic ESG pressure and international diplomatic scrutiny, have begun making their own supply chain commitments, though verification remains limited. The DRC's improved royalty structure is generating more state revenue, some of which has been directed toward health and education infrastructure in mining provinces. The Enough Project, a Washington-based advocacy organization focused on conflict resources in Africa, has argued that the combination of new regulation, increased traceability technology, including blockchain-based mineral tracking systems, and rising investor pressure on ESG grounds represents a genuine inflection point. They may be right. Others are less optimistic. Global Witness, which has tracked resource extraction abuses in the DRC for over 2 decades, published a report in 2023 arguing that voluntary corporate commitments without mandatory legal enforcement have a structural ceiling. Companies will clean up the parts of their supply chain that are visible to regulators and auditors and leave the rest intact. And the incentive to find the cheapest ore does not disappear because a corporation publishes a responsibility report. Now, here's what I think is coming. The electric vehicle revolution is not slowing down. The International Energy Agency projects that by 2030, electric vehicles will represent nearly 20% of all new car sales globally. That means cobalt demand will increase significantly regardless of what any individual corporation chooses to do. And until there is a viable, yet commercially scaled alternative battery chemistry that eliminates or dramatically reduces cobalt content, which battery researchers are working on, but which is not yet at mass production scale, the DRC's artisanal mining sector will continue to be the marginal supplier that makes the economics of the global cobalt market work. The EU battery regulation is the most significant structural change in the supply chain in the history of this industry. If it is actually enforced, and enforcement is the word that matters, it will create real traceability requirements for cobalt sold into European markets. That covers a significant share of global premium electronics and electric vehicles. I believe this regulation will produce genuine improvement in industrial supply chains, particularly for the large format batteries used in electric vehicles, where traceability is technically easier. I do not believe it will solve the artisanal mining problem, because the artisanal mining problem is downstream of a much larger issue, the DRC's inability, after 60 years of independence, to translate its extraordinary mineral wealth into functioning infrastructure, healthcare, and education for its own people. That inability is not simply a failure of Congolese governance. It is also the product of a global financial system that has consistently arranged for Congolese mineral wealth to be priced, financed, refined, and sold in ways that minimize the value captured by the people who live above those minerals. What could change my prediction is a genuine Chinese policy shift. If China's government, responding to domestic pressure, international diplomacy, or its own evolving ESG norms, required its cobalt trading companies to implement real due diligence, the impact on artisanal supply chains would be immediate and substantial. China processes 80% of the world's cobalt. If China changes the rules change for everyone. That is not impossible. It is not the direction current trends point, but it is worth watching. The thing I am most certain of is this: voluntary corporate commitments that are not backed by legal enforcement, independent auditing, and real financial penalties for non-compliance are a public relations strategy. They are not a supply chain strategy, and until governments in the consuming countries, the US, the EU, Japan, South Korea, treat cobalt supply chain abuse the same way they treat financial fraud, with legal accountability, not just press releases, the children in the shafts outside Congolese will remain the cheapest part of the global technology supply chain. The most advanced technology in the world runs on the most primitive form of labor extraction. That is not a paradox. That is a business model. 63 years after independence, the DRC is still being mined. The concession agreements have changed. The corporate logos have changed. The colonial administrators have been replaced by ESG reports and responsible sourcing pledges. But at the bottom of an 11-meter shaft outside Kolwezi, a 12-year-old boy is filling a grain sack for $1, and somewhere in a design studio in California or Seoul or Stuttgart, an engineer is specifying the battery chemistry for the next generation of electric vehicles. Those two people are in a relationship. They just have not been introduced. There are more stories like this one. Stories about the lithium under the salt flats of Bolivia, the rare earth minerals in Inner Mongolia, the coltan that financed a war that killed 5 million people, while European tech companies looked the other way. I am going to tell every one of them on this channel. Well, because these are not separate stories. They are chapters in the same book, and the book has not been finished yet. If that is the kind of story you need to understand the world you are living in, subscribe right now. Hit the notification bell. Share this video with someone who thinks their phone has nothing to do with Africa.